If you look at Egypt and in Tunisia, of course, what's been striking about these revolutions is actually how wide the protesting groups are. It's not just a matter of the youth. I think a lot of their parents are involved too. A lot of people in the business community are involved too. I mean, I think in Egypt you could see a number of investment bankers who were actively involved in the protests. Many very prominent business people who were sickened by the extent of the corruption were also very actively involved. So a lot of middle-aged people actually were involved too, and that gave it really a very unstoppable force. Facebook and Twitter has clearly been a major element in the whole thing. The regimes that we've seen pushed aside came into power at a time when they could micromanage information. They often had very little kind of telephone communication, anything like that. So clearly the fact that people can communicate amongst themselves, can send out messages about what's happening, keep events in the public eye, both domestically and internationally, has played a huge role in enabling the mobilization of such large and diverse numbers of people. And I think the diversity perhaps is the key, in that it's not just a matter of a class or trade unions or workers or so on. It's the social media has allowed a much greater inclusiveness of the people who are involved in these kind of actions, and that's been very much its strength. Libya in many ways is a much more primitive kind of state than some of the other countries. The independent judiciary, there's really no institutions there that could actually stand on their own feet, apart from perhaps the National Oil Corporation. It's also the geography of Libya is quite important in that it's very much in two halves. The place where the uprising started was in the east in Benghazi, which is widely separated from the capital. That's similar in a sense to Tunisia in that the revolution started in the periphery and moved to the center, but I think just the physical distance and the difficulty of connecting with the people in Tripoli. I think tribalism has played a part in this as well, although there's arguments about whether this can be exaggerated or not. But I think that the other thing which is clear in Libya is that you did not have the army taking a position on the side of the people. You had a much more fragmented situation there, and that's partly because of the nature of the army. And that Gaddafi never let the army develop into a strong enough institution to threaten him. Another important aspect of this whole revolutionary movement has been a refinement in the way that the outside world's going to have to look at the whole concept of Islamism. In Egypt, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood's been involved in the uprising and has now formed a political party and is going to get involved in the political process. But they very much are not in charge of the process. And I think that that's a reflection of longer-term trends in that the, if you like, peaceful Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood have been short of ideas on the constructive side. It's been quite easy for them to operate on the basis that Islam is the solution without having to actually work out where they stand on certain policies, because that takes them into difficult territory doctrinally as to whether they are fundamentalist or whether they're modernist and progressive, which brings them into a historicist type of approach of Islam. You have to decide whether to apply all of what's in the Sharia literally. Another fatal flaw perhaps that's undermined the Islamist movement or the idea of an Islamist takeover has actually been Al-Qaeda. Though in many respects we've seen Al-Qaeda as being successful in the sense that it's grabbed the world's attention, that it's caused a great deal of trouble, whether it be 9/11 or in the events in Iraq after the US-led invasion. However, Al-Qaeda has been regarded as being morally bankrupt by huge numbers of people in the Islamic community, and even Islamist activists, people who previously thought that violence was legitimate, have actually argued very forcefully against the whole Al-Qaeda worldview. And of course, as we see in Libya, the dictators use the Al-Qaeda bogeyman as one of the excuses to stay in power, and that clearly no longer works, as people can see through it, that Al-Qaeda are not the threat to actually take over these societies that's sometimes been imagined. There's going to be some very difficult issues that the new governments and parties as they form will have to grapple with. And one of those, of course, is the economic policy that they're going to follow. Because a lot of the opposition in Egypt was focused on corruption, which was associated with economic liberalization. And I think there is a risk that the good bits of economic liberalization, and certainly there were some, could be ditched in a kind of witch hunt against anybody in the business class who've all been tarred with the same brush of corruption and crony capitalism. Clearly, the main things to watch over the weeks and months ahead is how things work out in the countries where the revolutions have happened, in Egypt and Tunisia and of course in Libya. There'll also be a lot of attention paid to countries like Saudi Arabia, where we have some stirrings of revolt, some reaction from the government, and of course a very skittish oil market as a result, because of course Saudi Arabia is the biggest oil exporter in the world and will continue to be so. I think it's potentially salutary in Saudi Arabia, but it's going to be difficult and complicated by the fact that you have this sort of aging leadership, you have a relatively reformist king, but who is going to pass away sooner or later. And what's coming down the line is perhaps a more conservative kind of approach. So there is a sort of zero tolerance line coming out from the Saudi authorities towards people who are pushing for kind of constitutional reforms. Saudi Arabia, of course, has a lot of power to dispense patronage and funds, and have unveiled this huge package of economic measures to address unemployment and other sort of issues. The other thing, of course, I think that should be borne in mind in countries like Saudi Arabia and even Libya is that whoever takes power there will be interested in maintaining the oil sector. So although we've seen oil prices spike, I think in the medium to long term it's illogical to expect that revolution or potentially salutary political change in the Middle East will necessarily result in the region's oil production being cut off or sharply curtailed.